Hi, I'm Donald Tallman, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. For more than 50 years, our museum here in Golden, Colorado has acquired and restored vintage railroad equipment. However, to support our collections, we've also added other facilities such as a roundhouse and turntable, a loop of track, and a well-stocked research library. On the equipment side, Rio Grande Locomotive 5771 was acquired some years ago. It had the honor of pulling the California Zephyr, the Rio Grande Zephyr, and the Rio Grande Ski Train. Through the years, all of these museum milestones were accomplished by a dedicated group of people who had a dream, rolled up their sleeves, and made that dream become reality. I'd like you to meet some of them.
All right, I have a confession to make. When we were getting started toward our expansion projects that have got us to this stage where we are today, I remember telling the people on the board who were reluctant to make some of these steps. We had a nice little core group, but we knew that in order to stay relevant in this society, changes were going to have to be made.
So my involvement was, originally I'm a consultant to nonprofit organizations, and I was called by Chuck Albee to come and talk to the museum about potentially helping them to do a capital campaign to build a new library, a roundhouse, and acquire some land for expansion of the museum. And that was back in 1992. Well, they called me, and once I started working with Chuck Albee and Chuck Paddock, I took some time to look at the financials of the museum, the board of the museum as an organization. And I was so impressed with their organization. It was a small nonprofit with big goals that were very achievable. Well, the goal was to raise money for a new library and the roundhouse. And originally we were trying to raise $1.2 million to build those buildings. And Chuck Albee and Chuck Paddock were rather incredulous that I said, oh yes, you can do this. And so it was very exciting to meet them both and to work with them, and then later to meet members of the board and work with them as well. In order to raise the $1.2 million needed for that project, the organization needed to have at least 10% in hand from the inner circle, which is really the board members, the volunteers, and people that love the museum. And they already had that in hand. And so that challenge, which is typically there in the beginning of a capital campaign, had already been taken care of by the board through their organization. The people that we contacted were the larger area foundations that contribute to capital campaigns in Colorado. So that would be Coors, Gates, Anschutz, El Pomar, and the Betcher Foundation. And those foundations were very willing to help out the Colorado Railroad Museum. The Colorado Railroad Museum is extremely unique in the area with just a depth of knowledge and capital assets that you just don't find readily. So these foundations were very interested in participating.
It was fortunate at the time in the economy that there was a good period for getting large donations. First from the foundations that Roseanne had mentioned, and also it happened with a couple of individuals. It was a time, I guess, when everything was lined up correctly, and Roseanne gave us the opportunity to seize the moment, the skills that we needed. It helped to get your foot in the door because a lot of nonprofits don't get that far. But when you get in the door, at least you've got their attention. But then it's a complicated process. Lots of questions, lots of standards you have to meet, and that's it's almost like filling out an IRS application. We had to get it the old-fashioned way. We had to earn it. We had to work for it. We had some private individuals. One in particular, I remember, Dr. Howard Young was a professor at an Eastern college who was a single person, died and left no heirs, and he left us his entire estate. Carrie Arnold was a wonderful person to have on our board, both as somebody who could get things done and somebody who could kind of organize the group. You know, our board wasn't entirely totally you know, all pulling in the same direction on this, and Carrie had the ability, if she said to do something, the other members would fall in line.
Alexis Mckinney was an absolutely wonderful person. He had a long history in newspaper work, and he eventually settled in Denver and was handling public relations for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. I met Alexis early on and we became close friends. At one point in time, the Board of Trustees decided to invite Alexis to join the board as a trustee. So we met, and he said, well, I've decided not to do it. And that was very, very bad news, but I'm stubborn and persistent. And so I said, well, Alexis, we really need you on the board. You're exactly the kind of person who should be a trustee. And it isn't that big a deal. You just have to bring some common sense and business experience to the board, and you'll do a wonderful job, and we really need you. And he grumbled for a while, as he often did, and said, well, all right, I'll try it. But over the years, Alexis had so many connections, it was just unbelievable, the people he knew. And one of those people was Bob Sweeney, who was to become the executive director of the Kenneth Kendall King Foundation. As we were raising money to build the library and the Roundhouse, we were soliciting money from various organizations in Colorado. And Alexis thought that the Kenneth Kendall King Foundation would be someone that would perhaps give us some money. So we went down and met with Bob Sweeney. We met with Mr. King and came out and had lunch with him. And eventually he was one of our first major donors to the library fund. He gave us $100,000 and then some more later on.
Well, when we were going to do all the construction of everything from a loop, the Roundhouse, and the library was included, we had stuff all over the property. And Robert was not a file clerk, unfortunately, and we're going to outdo that. And we had our stuff everywhere. Every boxcar was actually a moving library, and we had to do the work to get everything back to normal. From there, we did a raising of funds, and we started off with Dick Dorman, the architect, and we just started working with him and getting things accomplished. He had some things he wanted to do, and I had some things I wanted to do, and got it, and things from the other trustees, other volunteers, to make it all go right. We probably have built a super strong library building, but it's also got all the heating and cooling that makes the thing just like a regular archival library.
Larry Breen and Dick Dorman were partners in an architectural firm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, one that had quite a good reputation. They did a lot of the public buildings, banks, homes down in that area. And our connection with it was that Dick Dorman was a railroad buff, member of the museum, and is also an author of several rail books, but he offered to do our architectural plans as his part of the donation to our fundraising efforts and our expansion. And so we were quite pleased to have his services. I think he did a great job designing our library building in the style of an old railroad depot. We're quite often asked, oh, which railroad depot did that used to be? Which says something about the building that he did.
Well, we had to do a lot of stuff, even to figure out the water table in the back of the old house. So we had to have a water company come out and drill a few holes. and we now know where the dry parts are, but from the ditch above, that flows underground so far. And the library back door is pretty close to that. So I also worked it out with the doorman that I didn't want toilets in the middle of the building. And that's why it's a little jog, so that if a toilet overflows, it's not going to get anywhere in the main building. We just open the door and shovel out the water. And haven't had to do that yet, but it's come close. There were also a lot of other just odds and ends that the architect wanted that I didn't. He wanted a fireplace, and not in an archives building. You don't want that. The building is very strong. It's got wooden beams, so you can drop tens of boxes on this stuff, because books and paper get heavy. Well, it was sort of here we go, because we had to haul all the books from the basement of the other museum all the way over to our new building, and then figure out where they go. And that took a long time to do. We were constantly sorting, and but it was interesting. It's finally happening. Academica that we use to store the books, look at the books, look at the papers, look at the maps, and that's what we're well noted for. We have a lot of pamphlets, supply catalogs. We have periodicals. We have over 400 titles and periodicals. And then pictures of every kind of size you can imagine, mostly in black and white, but there's some color. We have some film. We just have even stereograms related to railroads. And then we have valuation papers. We have files and files and files of railroad records, mostly Colorado Southern, Rio Grande, and Union Pacific, and then a sprinkling of everybody else. So we have a little of everything.
The biggest change that occurred in the museum while I've been involved with it, at any rate, is the switch from a group of dedicated rail fans preserving equipment, doing some operations, was to make that transition to the public that we have outside and need to attract today. The whole approach has changed over the years. The turntable, the Roundhouse, my spot on the board was generally involved bringing what expertise I could from the various tourist railroads that we have operated over the years, and trying to help the board members understand the implications of operations as opposed to just simply having a static museum. This is now an operating museum, and the demands on the volunteers and the way your guests are handled are just totally different from a static museum that maybe has once or twice a year a little bit of operations. I've tried to bring that aspect of having to be up and ready to go every morning for, say, a 100-day operating season. I tried to translate those experiences for our board of directors when we were trying to make these decisions as to not only the length of this turntable, the number of stalls in the engine house, things of that nature.
Well, the Iron Horse Motel has quite a role in the history of the museum. When Bob Richardson and Corny Hauk established it in 1958, their idea was that the motel would provide a source of income for supporting the museum. Well, it didn't take them long to discover that that wasn't a good business plan. They sold it off in just a short time, and for several years it was a decent place to stay, convenient for a lot of the rail fans coming here, a place like was typical of the late 50s, early 60s. Well, as time went on, it kind of descended from that. It changed hands several times and ended up with what you could best describe as being a flop house. You know, some unsavory people living there, involved in unsavory activities, and so we were looking for our expansion, we needed to buy the place back again. We needed not only to get rid of that, but the space to complete our loop of track.
We had this small section of track. Once we made the decision as a board that we would like to expand our operations here, get a continuous circle of track, I'd say it probably took us about a year from start to finish, from the planning to getting the additional rail. It took rail, it took ties, all of these donated materials, and I would say the local railroads in town and others stepped forward to literally help us from the financial standpoint and from the standpoint of having the expertise to put down runnable loop of track. Not track that's just holding cars for display, but something you can actually safely run on. One of the more interesting thing is when we were talking about putting the loop around here, a lot of the time was spent on how big a loop, what the curvature would be on the loop. We're in a relatively small space, museums mostly are, and so we had to do a lot of adaptation of what perhaps a major railroad would do if they were laying track. We had to make a lot of compromises. And of course, this is narrow gauge. This is the original gauge between the two rails, 3 feet. This is the original Colorado standard gauge. Standard gauge itself being 4 feet 8.5 inches. So this is 3 feet against that. It actually gave us an advantage because the ties are smaller, the rail is smaller, and it made it possible for us to do an awful lot of this work ourselves.
It was a Rio Grande locomotive. It worked on the first California Zephyr and various other trains until it was demoted to work train service, and then just kind of put away in the yards at Burnham in Denver and not used anymore. We'd had kind of a commitment from the railroad that, yeah, well, maybe they would give it to us. Well, things got more and more complicated as time went by because the Rio Grande bought the Southern Pacific, and all of this equipment became titled in the name of the Southern Pacific. Well, Alexis Mckinney knew these people down at the headquarters, and he went down and said, look, we've been promised this locomotive, you're not ever going to do anything with it, and it's time to donate it to the museum. And the locomotive was given to us the day before the Southern Pacific completely took over, so we just barely got it.
Well, between Chicago and San Francisco, we're probably the biggest library, railroad library. And their thing there's Union Pacific, but I think we have more stuff than they have. Of course, they got a whole railroad. The Burlington, there are parts and pieces here and there. Some of it we've acquired. But we're right up there with the big boys. Now, if you go to the Smithsonian, of course, that's a whole new world. But even back east, we're still bigger than some of them.
First of all, we all wanted the museum to survive, and that was, who knew what was going to happen in those days when we didn't have any money, and the income from ticket sales to the museum was not all that great. But we all saw this as something that was wonderful to have to preserve Colorado Railroad history. And we all worked toward that.
So essentially, during this decade, after Bob's retirement and up until to the turn of the 21st century, we provided the foundation for everything that we're doing today, completing the loop of track. The Roundhouse, where we could do major repairs, bring things like locomotive 491 back to life again, keep the historic exhibits up to par. It all would not have been possible, not only because of that, but you look at the individuals that we mentioned. There are others that were on the board at that time, which were Paul Looning. I don't want to overlook Paul. Paul was our construction manager during the building of the library and the Roundhouse. His calling in life was as project manager for the Bureau of Reclamation. So he knew how to deal with contractors, you know. He did as much for us in his area as Chuck Paddock did for us in the accounting, and as Roseanne Stern did, and other board members, Alexis Mckinney I mentioned.
We are, I think, listed as one of the top 10 attractions in Colorado, or at least in the Denver area, for tourists to come and visit. So we've gotten to the point where we're well known and well regarded in the community.
The group of us that got together and had what I'll call the vision to try to save all of this stuff had to change our focus to presenting it not to other rail buffs, but to the general public. And that is where our mission is today and what we're all about.
As I said before, these dedicated folks rolled up their sleeves and made their dream a reality. That's just what we continue to do today. So, join us in making our future dreams a reality too.